Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second bit of asynchronous content for week 5. As you should know, your first 2 to 3 page paper is due at the end of this week. This is instead of a normal blog post. There's no normal response this week, just the 2 to 3 page paper. I've already received a couple of questions about it, and I know that there's a lot of questions to be had about the prompt. So the purpose of this video is to sort of reiterate some of the requirements for the paper, and also to give you some examples for how you can approach this task. So I just want to go over the requirements here. You should select a design or a design object created after 1972 in which the influence of the theories considered thus far can be seen. So you're taking contemporary design and you're viewing it through the lens of the theories that we've looked at so far, most of which goes back to much earlier in the 20th century. So you'll select an object, and I've provided you a couple of links. You can really choose any design or design object that you'd like, as long as it can sort of be defined with very specific parameters. And I'll tell you more about that in just a second. And you'll begin with a brief description of the object. Tell us about the designer who created it and the historical circumstances under which it was made. This should be a sort of brief sort of framework that you're giving us for the object. Considering these factors, examine the ways in which the creator was responding directly or indirectly to theories relating to linguistics or semiology, avant-garde art movements, or the psychological perception of forms. AKA, how was the creator responding to the theories that we've read so far, right? You should be thinking about everything we've covered up until this point and think about how the design relates to that. Discuss the manner in which the design you've chosen embodies the theories we've covered. Provide direct references to relevant passages from our readings. Quotes are great, highly encouraged. And locate additional writings using library resources to substantiate your comparisons. You don't have to do deep research for this. If you find a couple others, that's excellent, that's amazing, but it's really mostly about locating the design and then framing it within what we've read so far. Your goal is a critical examination, not a historical account. Okay, so we're not just giving the history of the designer. We're not just giving the history of the design. We're going to describe it briefly, mention who the designer was, and then really concentrate on the theory behind it. Your response will be 750 to 1,000 words, double space, Times New Roman. It's a 2 to 3 page paper, but I will go by word count, so you can't fool me with 16-point Arial or something. Include an image of the work in consideration and any other relevant illustrations. Maybe there's a couple different images you'd like to include along with your text. Cite all materials and any related writings and image sources. So make sure you provide in your bibliography not just the source for any articles that you mention, but also cite the source for the imagery. So if you find it on a website or something, be sure to include that in your bibliography. And you should use MLA format for that bibliography. I'm not going to be a super stickler about that, but you should be able to find some format generators online. You'll type this up as if it's a paper, and you'll upload a PDF to an open lab post. Okay, so again, that's the general framework. I've already invited questions, but if you have any more questions about this, please post them. Please attach them to this post or email me. Questions are encouraged if any of this is unclear, okay? So I have 2 examples for you that I hope will be instructive, that I hope will sort of give you an idea of what the expectations are for this. And I've specifically picked 2 very different types of designs to give you some examples of what you might consider. So the first one I picked sort of because I don't want anybody to do this. I think it's like it's a design that's everywhere. You've probably heard about it in multiple classes. You've probably talked about it numerous times. It's a great design. I don't want to discount it in any way, but I'm sick of hearing it. I don't want you to write your paper about this. You're not allowed to write your paper about this. You cannot talk about either of the designs that I mentioned. So please, I mean, don't write your paper about this because I won't accept it. It's not please anything, but don't write your paper about this. I think it's also a good sort of tool, a good image, a good design to think about though. So I'm going to use it to give us an outline for what we should do. It's the Shepard Fairey Hope poster of Barack Obama. It's actually untitled Barack Obama portrait. Everybody knows it as the Hope portrait, right? Shepard Fairey created this in 2008. It's a color screen print on paper measuring 36 by 24 inches. Okay, that's the original format for this design. That's its intended format. And I really want to emphasize that this is the design object sense. It's a poster, right? But it's not a meme. It's not just an image on the internet. Many of us have accessed it that way. Many of us are familiar with it on those terms, but to talk about it as a design object, we should understand that this is a poster with a specific size. Okay, and that's what I mean by design object. I do not want to see papers about logos or about anything that is kind of like an intangible, it cannot be about a typeface. It has to be about a discrete design that's intended to appear in a particular format. So a poster or a book cover are great things to think about. Okay, even a website that's meant so that it can be seen on your desktop browser or on a mobile device or on a reader and an iPad or whatever. It's not one design, it becomes multiple designs and it becomes very complicated to talk about that. So you must pick something that has a discrete size and shape, okay? It's really important for this. I know that design exists in all forms today, but the way we analyze this for this particular paper, it's important that it has a definable size and shape too, okay? So, and it's important that you know all of these details. We've all seen this image. If you can't state that it was Shepard Fairey who made this and it was made in 2008, then you need to either do more research or pick another design, okay? It's important that we have the basic details, including the creator, the title, the year. Media is great to have, and the size of the design, okay? When I sit down to write my paper, I can give a brief description. I can spend a paragraph sort of outlining all of this and saying what it was and that Shepard Fairey designed it for the presidential campaign. And it was important as a sort of grassroots organizing tool for hanging in the windows of campaign offices and things like that. But that's a paragraph. That's a nice introductory paragraph. You should really not dedicate your paper to, telling us about the 2008 election. That doesn't really matter. Don't get bogged down in that, okay? Instead, go back to all of our readings and think about how those readings might relate back to this image, right? And I'll go through them pretty methodically here. You do not have to talk about every reading. You should just pick the ones that are most relevant. And I think a good way to do that is to sit down with each reading, kind of flip through it, and note any kind of comparisons that you can be made. I've actually done it right here. I've done it for this design and another one, and I've sat down with every reading we've had so far, and I've looked at some similarities or some quotes, some ideas that relate back to this image. I'm not going to talk about the Helen Armstrong reading because she sort of covers a lot of ground and talks and sort of summarizes a lot of what we're reading. So I'm going to skip over that one, and you can pull quotes from it, but I think that you shouldn't dwell too much on it. I'll start with Bruno Munari. And the first thing that caught my attention is there is in the short piece called Design as Art, which we read, Munari says that the artist should be prepared to make a sign for a butcher shop, that there should be a relationship between the art and the public. Now, this is not for a butcher shop, obviously, but a general election for president is a matter of great public concern. So I do think that there's a relationship here that Shepard Fairey could have sort of turned his nose up to the idea of kind of promoting a political candidate, and especially in a grassroots way where he wasn't even paid or anything. He just did this on his own. Instead, he used his voice as an artist to create public awareness. He didn't see like designing posters as anything sort of lesser than what an artist should do, and therefore established a great connection between the artist and the public. So I think right there is a great example of design as art in the way that Bruno Munari talks about it. And this is maybe this is a great starting point to consider. I'll then turn to the Saussure text. I don't know if this is necessarily linguistic per se. It's not about spoken language in the way that Saussure talks about it, but I do think there is a strong semiological dimension to this design, right? We have a very simple bit of text. We have an image, right? We might think back to even the way that the sign signifier relationship is illustrated in the Saussure text. We have this sort of word underneath an image. We have a concept and a sound image, right? Well, here we have a kind of, instead of a sound image, we have a word, we have a typographic image, hope. And but we do still see that image connected to the concept of Barack Obama, the concept of the first Black president, the concept that this will provide hope for a new future. By connecting this one very simple word to an image of Obama looking off into the distance, I think there's a very complex system of signs at work. There's a very sort of rich semiological meaning. And whether it's truly that the word hope is a signifier and the picture of Obama is a signified, I don't think it really matters that much. I think that we can read this as a sort of semiological relationship between the word hope and the image of Barack Obama, right? And that's a sort of loose reading of Saussure's text, but I think it's very relevant. And I think it actually sort of helps connect to some of the other texts we've looked at. Namely, from that same week, the Ellen Lupton and Abbott Miller readings, I like to think about this in terms of the different writing systems, right? We have a very small bit of alphabetic representation here, alphabetic display of meaning with the word hope, right? But then we can also think about the different systems that they mention, a rebus as one way to communicate meaning, or a pictographic system. I would say that this almost becomes an ideographic writing system, right? We have this alphabetic type that says hope, and then we have this image of Barack Obama who represents all of these ideals. This sort of portrait could be seen almost as an ideograph, right? As a picture that conveys a bigger concept, a bigger meaning, right? And this is maybe another way we could approach this, thinking about the semiological dimension of the image. And this was from that last essay from Ellen Lupton and Abbott Miller. Remember, it was called Language of Dreams. That's the one I pulled from there. We then go to the next week of readings and think about first the Marinetti Futurist Manifesto. I don't think there's much of a connection there, honestly. We might be able to sort of talk about destroying the old or something like that, but I think it would be a little bit of a stretch. And I'm not really interested in framing this through that lens. So I'm going to skip over that one. You might choose that text and sort of dismiss the constructivists, depending on which one you're talking about. And again, we don't have to use all of our texts. We're just trying to pick a handful, even if you talk about 3 of them and how those are relevant to the design, then that's great. That's amazing. I'll go forward to the Who We Are manifesto. There's maybe something about the element, new experiments for the future, something like that. But even then, I don't think that one's super relevant either. However, from that same set of texts, El Lissitzky's Our Book manifesto contains a lot of similarities and might really help us to understand this image. I'm thinking right off the bat about the way he addresses materialization or materialism and dematerialization. And there's a funny relationship at play here. In Lissitzky's time, dematerialization meant making lighter, easily transported books. Well, this poster does that, but it also, we should also remember that it existed in relationship to very aggressive social media campaigns, right? So as many of us have seen this as a digital image, we should recognize that the material poster also played a very powerful role in a dematerialized form of digital communication. And that Lissitzky was probably right when he was thinking about communication technologies of the future. Even if we're not talking specifically about a book here, Lissitzky's talking about the ways that material and dematerialized images and ideas will circulate. And I think this is a very powerful example of the future that Lissitzky was looking forward to. Remember, he also said that the book of the future would make representation primary and the alphabet secondary. Just as Lissitzky made his book of two squares where the images are meant to tell a story and there's a little bit of text on the sides just to sort of fill it in, I think we see the same thing happening here. This portrait of Barack Obama, this illustrated version of that portrait, tells a story about the future of the United States, and then the alphabetic text underneath just fills it in a little bit, just sort of supplies a little bit more background information. Remember that Lissitzky was also thinking about the way that the book would reach the masses, the largely illiterate masses in his time. But we have to also understand that the masses in our time don't necessarily sit down and read all the little details of a policy proposal for every single candidate. Instead, people look for images. The great masses look for a form of communication that will speak to them directly. That's exactly what Lissitzky was trying to do when he talked about our book, the book of the future. And that's exactly what Shepard Fairey did when he created this poster. I don't think he sat down and read Lissitzky's manifesto and said, oh, I'm going to do this, but we can definitely trace a number of relationships between what Lissitzky dreamed for the book and what Shepard Fairey did with this poster. I'm going to jump forward to this week's readings and think about Walter Gropius and the founding of the Bauhaus. There's only a couple things that are relevant. I don't think this is the most directly relevant, but just to mention the idea that Gropius is thinking about his terms, he says he wants a technique of simple effectiveness. Well, I think that this does that exactly. And he also talks about the need for a genuine folk art, meaning something outside of the museums, a real art for the people. And we could argue that the street art graffiti background that Shepard Fairey comes from is actually a little bit of a genuine folk art, right? It's actually something that is an art that's made by people for the people, that communicates to the people, and maybe there's a connection there. Walter Gropius is also thinking about dispensing with art for art's sake. I think that's exactly what this does. This is art for political sake, art for very specific social ends, and I think this absolutely does that. So those are a couple ways in which it might be related. We could also look at the typo photo essay from Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. In this image, we have an interplay of photographic and typographic elements. We should recognize that it's not really actually photographic. It's transformed through screen printing into an illustration, right? So it's not truly typo photo in the way that Moholy-Nagy is thinking about, but it still blends the ideas of the photographic image with the type and creates them in one unified form in the way that Moholy-Nagy is talking about. So I don't think it's completely off base to reference that essay, although with all the great connections we're making between the constructivists and Munari, it might not even be necessary. The same with the Herbert Bayer essay. It's maybe not deeply relevant. We could look at some ideas about clarity. We could think about the way that images are conditioned by the different relationships to typography. There's a lot in Bayer that we might think about. We could also think about the ways that Bayer is striving for a universal visual medium, and maybe Shepard Fairey's touching on some of that with the simple colors and the really the simplified sans serif typeface. We could find some connections, and it wouldn't be very far off base. The same thing with the Beatrice Ward reading for this week. You could look at the idea of the crystal goblet and the way that typography works. Again, it's not the one that I'm most interested in, but it's something that could certainly be made to be applicable. I just wanted to finally mention the George Kepish reading also for this week, and think about this notion of dynamic iconography. I think that's exactly what we're seeing with this image. Kepish says that the artist should release and bring into social action the dynamic forces of visual imagery. That's exactly what happens here, right? This is a dynamic image that Shepard Fairey takes and transforms into social action. This is exactly what Kepish is talking about. He also talks about the ways that meaningful signs play a role in art. Those meaningful signs were disintegrated in modern art and then reintegrated into different pictorial elements that can be used by advertisers and designers today. And I think that that's exactly what Shepard Fairey was doing. He's harnessing the human psyche. He's looking at these different forms, and he's sort of pulling all of our attention together towards this dynamic iconography. Again, I don't think he sat down and read George Kepish and thought about how he was going to do that, but I think it's absolutely relevant, right? So with all that in mind, we can sit down and organize our thoughts, cover a few of those most relevant readings. Personally, I would probably follow some of the semiological elements, probably starting with a little bit of Munari, then through Saussure, definitely talk about El Lissitzky, and then wind up with George Kepish. And once I work my way all through all of those and give a little conclusion, I easily have my 750 to 1,000 words, okay? So that's my first example. The second one is very different, and intentionally so, because this idea of a design object, it can be graphic design, it can be sort of very visual, or you can use something that's more like industrial design, something that moves outside of the strictly visual. And I think that this is actually an example of another very powerful design that sort of borders on fashion and industrial design, and it's very sort of purposive and purposeful without just being a sort of fashion accessory or something. So I'm talking about the Fjallraven Konken. It's actually really the actual object is called a Konken, and it's designed by Ake Norden, who built the Fjallraven brand. You've probably seen this. You've probably seen people wearing these around. Half of you probably have one. It's a very popular backpack. The first one was made in 1978. You can get different sizes now, but I'm going to focus on the original one from 1978, which is 15 inches by 10.5 inches by 5 inches. So it's made of vinylon and polypropylene. They use different materials now, and they come in all different sizes, but I'm thinking specifically about the very first one of these that was made in 1978. And I'm also thinking about that one in particular because it had a very specific purpose. Age Norden read an article that was talking about the sort of the health and back issues that students were having from carrying large stacks of books to class. So he had this idea of making a backpack that would be easier, that would make it easier to carry the books and would sort of improve the lives of the school children that needed to carry their books. And so he set about designing this backpack. So how does that fit into the other theories that we've looked at? Once again, I'll go back to Bruno Munari. I like in the later essay that we read called "What is a Designer?" Munari talks about the fact that design should be functional, that there should be a formal coherence to design, no matter what sort of design a designer is working on. It should make sense to serve its purposes. He says that the designer should make the object as a tree makes a leaf, right? So you start with the particular needs. And I think that this is a good embodiment of that. I think that Ake Norden sat down and he said, here is a sort of group of users, the school children of Sweden who need backpacks. And I think I can solve the problem that fits their particular needs. It's a leaf that fits on that particular tree, right? It's not necessarily designed for different groups, even for adults, really. They make different sizes for adults now, but that original one was meant to solve a very particular problem in a very precise kind of way. So there's one connection there. I'm going to skip right over Saussure for this one. I don't think it's terribly relevant. I don't think there's much of a sort of linguistic dimension. I'll go to the next image. If I wanted to analyze the logo or something and get into the semiological dimension here, I might do that, but I think it's one of the least relevant. And I think the same goes with the Ellen Lupton and Abbott Miller readings as well. Those are about the ways that we represent through written language or through simple forms of visual communication. And I think that this is a design that doesn't really emphasize that in the same way. That's not driven by that same set of interests. We could think about that sort of the image of the fox and how it relates to the brand name, but I don't think it's the most relevant part. I think we've got plenty more to talk about. The same thing with the Marinetti Futurist Manifesto. I'm not sure that this has much to do with futurism. It's not about crashing the car through the wall of speed or something like that, right? It's not about destroying the old institutions. We can talk about how it's almost opposite of the Futurist Manifesto, how it's not about sort of having the brand new, sharpest new technology all the time, that it's about a return to simplicity. And that's one way we could address it. You can absolutely talk about your design object as something that's opposed to something we've read, and that's also great. But if anything, that's how this fits in with the Futurist Manifesto. If we look at the Constructivist Manifesto, Who We Are, by Radchenko, Varvara Stepanova, and Alexei Gan, I think we have a lot in common there. The way that artists became constructors, right? The way that the constructivists saw themselves as the beginning of something new. They said, we're not going to work with the highest technology. We're not here to make skyscrapers. We're here to make mugs, boots, a floor mop, right? Whatever other sort of simple household objects. That's exactly what Ake Norden was trying to do here, right? This is exactly the approach that he was taking with this design. The new society, the better society that designers can bring doesn't have to come from some grand new radio station or something like that. It starts with the normal everyday objects that improve people's lives. And I think this backpack is very constructivist in that sense. It's made for the people. It's intended to be sold at a relatively low price point, which is, I know, debatable these days, but that's the intention of it. And it was meant to be an accessible object that everyone can have. And in fact, it became sort of the standard backpack for school children across all of Sweden. And it became a sort of powerful symbol of that as well. And it almost in the way that Varvara Stepanova envisioned something like the unisex sport clothes, this almost became the unisex backpack for everyone to carry and to use. And in that way, I think it actually achieves what the constructivists we're trying to do in a way that's almost better than what the constructivists actually achieved themselves. We could also think about, there's a line in there where they said everything will be constructed of lines and grids. And I think that that's exactly the approach here. This sort of square shape, although it gets beat up over time, is meant as almost a sort of a grid with volume, the space that will accommodate modern life and will accommodate books and all of the information that we carry around. We could carry that forward to Lissitzky's manifesto and think about, I like to think about that line where Lissitzky says that the first invention is always a single event in time, that it's rough and ready, the way that Gutenberg's Bible is an example of the finest book printing ever because it's the first one, and daguerreotypes are the finest photographs. The same could be said about this backpack. Backpacks were less common. This was an early form of a backpack for school children. And in some ways, it's the most perfect form. And maybe the sort of resurgence in popularity, the fact that this is still a very popular bag, reaching well beyond young school children, might be proof of that, right? It might go to show that that's exactly what Ake Norden achieved. We can then move forward to Walter Gropius's manifesto again, his founding of the Bauhaus. And in that essay, Gropius talks about the ways that different forms are embodiments of ideas. He uses this idea, he says, you're going to give form to space. I think that's exactly what happened here. Ake Norden had this idea, he gave it shape, he gave it a very sort of tangible size. This is the best way that design can come to be, according to Walter Gropius. It seems that, and returning to that essay, Gropius talks about there's an observation of form, of materials, volume. All these things are so important when you think about this object and how it's going to fit on a person's body, right? And I think Ake Norden was very attuned to those ideas. Gropius also talks about, art triumphing over nature, and maybe that's what's happening here. Design is sort of triumphing over the pain of carrying a big, heavy load of books. And then finally, he talks about the joy of building, right? This is something that Gropius gets into, understanding the practical and formal concepts that come with making something new, with constructing. And I think that that's exactly what we see here. We see this kind of, these practical problems that take form in a really beautiful and maybe joyful kind of way. We can look at Moholy-Nagy and his typo photo. I think is not really relevant. I'm going to skip right over that one. The same thing with Herbert Bayer. He's talking about typography, probably not that relevant, although we could also think about an analogy to perhaps to the typography that Bayer had hoped for, right? Herbert Bayer says there should be a universal typeface that can be used for everything. Well, maybe there's a similar approach, a universal backpack that everyone could use and that could just be everywhere. And even if that wasn't the intention of Ake Norden, he kind of achieved that. When you look at the success and the presence of this bag around the world today, maybe there is something universal about it. We can apply some of those same principles when we think about the Beatrice Ward Crystal Goblet essay. There's, in that essay, Beatrice Ward, you will see, talks about modernist typography and how it serves as a conveyor or as a vessel for ideas, that type shouldn't attract any attention itself, that it's not an expression of beauty onto its own for its own sake, but it should be purposive, that there should be a good reason for it. And the artist creating it should express humility, that they should work for the end result rather than for the typographic beauty onto its own. Well, I think that Ake Norden actually does that here too. He's looking for the end result. How do you efficiently carry books? It's not about the sort of just beauty of the bag. The bag ends up being a beautiful, lovely object because it achieves that end goal, right? And then finally, George Kepish talks about, he's really talking about visual imagery. So I think that that one's not relevant. So in the case of this one, I would really focus on the constructivists. I might look at some of the Bauhaus principles, especially related to Walter Gropius. And then I might make an analogy to some kind of typographic ideas of universality or of being a conveyor, a vessel. And again, I think that that would give us plenty of material to type up, to think about, to properly address this design object. Okay, I hope this is helpful. Again, please post ideas, images, proposals. You don't have to have my approval for anything that you want to write about, but especially if you want to bounce ideas around, please post those so I can take a look. I'll be on top of this all week. I'll be watching for these. So if you have any questions about what you'd like to post and what theories you would use, or what you'd like to write about and what theories you'd like to address, please post them, and I'll be looking out for those throughout the week, okay? I know that writing a 2 to 3 page paper is not really considered fun by most people, but I think it can be a really interesting process, and I hope you enjoy doing it. I hope it really helps to sort of contextualize some of the things that we've been reading. Looking forward to the questions and looking forward to the papers. Thanks.